The law of the frontier is simple. You mind your own business, or the wilderness will mind it for you. For a woman living on the edge of crimson territory, that law was gospel. But when a solitary woman, haunted by her own silent sorrows, finds a native child cornered by wolves, the law of her heart proves stronger. She saves the boy, a child of the very people her community fears. That night, as the moon hangs like a skull over the plains, she doesn't find retribution at her door. Instead, the silent painted warriors of his tribe surround her cabin, not with weapons of war, but with gifts that unravel a story of desperation, sacrifice, and a secret that will change her life forever. The wind on the high plains of the Vulture territory was a restless spirit, a constant mourner that swept through the sparse grammar grass and clawed at the weathered timbers of Eleanor Vance's cabin. It was a lonely sound, the only one she had for company most days, save for the skittish rabbits and the occasional mournful cry of a distant coyote. At 28, Eleanor's world had shrunk to the size of her small homestead, a patch of stubborn dirt and a one-room cabin that stood as a solitary monument to a life that had veered violently off course. Her husband, Corporal George Vance of the 9th Cavalry, had been a good man, a strong man with a laugh that could fill a room, and hands that were as gentle with her as they were firm on the reins of his horse. He had promised her a life of adventure, a home carved out of the raw, untamed West. He had delivered on the home, but the adventure had been his alone. A final, fatal encounter with a band of Chiricahua that had left her a widow at 25. The same people the townsfolk of dusty Mesa Verde spat about in hushed, fearful tones were the architects of her solitude. 3 years had passed, each one a season of hardening. The soft-spoken woman who had followed her husband into the wilderness was gone, weathered away like the paint on the cabin's shutters. In her place was a woman of stark, unyielding resilience. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to needlepoint, were now calloused and capable, as adept at skinning a rabbit as they were at reloading the Remington rifle that leaned against the wall by her hearth. Her face, framed by strands of sun-bleached brown hair that had escaped her tight bun, was a roadmap of her grief and her grit, her blue eyes holding the vast, empty sorrow of the sky above. She rarely went to Mesa Verde anymore. The pitying glances of the women and the gruff, awkward condolences of the men were a salt press in a fresh wound. They saw a tragedy, a poor widow stranded on the frontier. They didn't see the quiet strength she had forged in the crucible of her loneliness. They didn't understand that the silence of the prairie had become her sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of her past could whisper without being drowned out by the hollow pleasantries of society. Her only regular visitor was Jedediah Stone, a grizzled old fur trapper who passed through twice a year, his mules laden with pelts and his saddlebags with gossip from the wider world. He'd known George, and his visits were a comfortable ritual of shared silence and potent home-brewed coffee. This particular afternoon, the sun was a merciless hammer beating down on the parched earth. Eleanor was out checking her snares, her worn leather boots kicking up puffs of red dust. The heat shimmered on the horizon, making the distant Dragon Mountains dance and blur. It was a day like any other, a slow, rhythmic progression of chores dictated by the sun and the seasons, until the sound came. It wasn't the wind, nor the cry of a hawk. It was a sound that didn't belong in her world of quiet survival, the terrified wail of a child. Her head snapped up, her hand instinctively going to the Colt peacemaker holstered at her hip. The sound was coming from a rocky outcrop a quarter-mile from her cabin, a jagged spine of granite that jutted from the plains like a broken bone. Her heart, a muscle she thought had grown numb, began to pound against her ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. Children were a rarity out here, a fragile currency she hadn't dealt in since the loss of her own. A stillborn daughter born a year before George's death. Another ghost that haunted the lonely cabin. Caution warred with a fierce primal instinct she hadn't felt in years. This was Crimson Land. A child out here alone could be a trap, a lure set by warriors hidden among the rocks. George had told her stories of such tactics, but the cry that echoed again was not a trick. It was pure, unadulterated terror, a sound that bypassed reason and struck a chord deep within her, the phantom ache of a mother's empty arms. She drew her Colt, the familiar weight of it a cold comfort in her hand, and began to move toward the sound, her steps light and deliberate. The closer she got, the more another sound mingled with the child's cries, the low guttural growls of a wolf pack. Her blood ran cold. Wolves, made bold by the long dry season, were a constant threat. For a child, they were a death sentence. She crested a small rise and saw them. A boy no older than 5 or 6 was backed into a shallow crevice in the rocks. His face was a mask of tear-streaked dirt, his small brown body clad only in a breechcloth. He was Chiricahua. The single feather tied in his long black hair and the intricate beadwork on his moccasins told her that. He held a small, crudely made wooden knife, a pathetic defense against the 4 lean, gray wolves that circled him, their lips curled back to reveal yellowed fangs, their hungry eyes fixed on their cornered prey. For a heartbeat, Eleanor froze. This was the son of her enemy, the people who had shattered her world. The bitter irony was a taste of ash in her mouth. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to turn back, to leave the boy to his fate, to let the wilderness claim one of its own. It was the law of the frontier. But then the boy's eyes met hers. In their dark, terrified depths, she didn't see a Chiricahua. She didn't see an enemy. She saw a child, small and helpless, and about to be torn apart. She saw the ghost of her own lost daughter, the what-ifs and might-have-beens that were the cruelest specters of her memory. The law of the frontier be damned. A guttural cry ripped from her own throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. "Get away from him!" The wolves, startled by the sudden intrusion, turned their attention to her. The alpha, a big male with a scarred muzzle and intelligent, malevolent eyes, took a step toward her, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She raised the Colt, the hammer already cocked, and fired. The shot cracked through the stillness of the afternoon, a sharp, violent punctuation to the silent drama. The bullet caught the alpha in the shoulder, and it yelped, stumbling back. The other wolves, unnerved by the loud report and the injury to their leader, hesitated, their predatory focus broken. Eleanor fired again, this time into the dirt in front of them, sending a shower of dust and rock fragments into their faces. That was enough. The alpha whimpered, turned, and limped away. And the rest of the pack, their courage broken, followed suit, melting back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the boy's ragged, hitching sobs. Eleanor stood for a long moment, the Colt still raised, her chest heaving. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the hot air. Slowly, she lowered the gun, her eyes fixed on the small figure huddled in the rocks. She holstered the Colt and approached him cautiously, her hands held out in a gesture of peace. "It's all right," she said, her voice softer than she had intended, raspy from disuse. "They're gone. You're safe." The boy flinched as she drew closer, pressing himself further into the crevice. His dark eyes, wide and luminous with unshed tears, watched her with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. He was trembling, a small leaf-shaken thing. "I'm not going to hurt you," Eleanor said, keeping her voice low and steady. She knelt down a few feet away, making herself smaller, less threatening. She could see now that he had a nasty gash on his leg, a bite from one of the wolves that had gotten too close. It was bleeding sluggishly, staining the rock beneath him. He said nothing, just stared at her, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. His silence was a wall between them, a barrier as real as the jagged rocks that surrounded them. Eleanor knew she couldn't leave him here. He was injured, alone, and miles from any possible settlement of his people. The wolves might return, or worse, he could succumb to his injury or the relentless heat. The decision was made before the thought had even fully formed. She was taking him back to her cabin. "Come on now," she said softly, extending a hand. "Let's get that leg looked at." The boy shrank back from her offered hand, his fear a palpable thing. He was a child of the wild, taught from birth to fear her kind, the white invaders who had taken their land and their lives. She was the monster from his people's stories, and she had a fire stick that made a sound like thunder. Eleanor sighed a long, weary sound. This was not going to be easy. But as she looked at the terrified child, a fierce protective instinct she thought had died with her daughter surged within her. She would not, could not, abandon him. She was no longer just a widow surviving on the edge of the world. She was a woman who had just stared down a wolf pack for a child who should have been her enemy. And in the vast, unforgiving silence of the prairie, that act had changed everything. The law of her heart had taken over, and she would have to face the consequences, whatever they may be. Getting the boy back to the cabin was an ordeal of silent negotiation. He refused to take her hand, his small body rigid with a fear that was almost painful to witness. In the end, Eleanor simply stood, her posture deliberately non-threatening, and began to walk slowly back the way she had come. After a few paces, she glanced back. The boy was still huddled in the rocks, his dark eyes tracking her every move. She stopped and waited. The sun beat down, and the silence stretched thick and heavy. Finally, with a visible effort that seemed to cost him all his courage, he pushed himself to his feet, hissing in pain as he put weight on his injured leg. He began to follow her, limping badly, keeping a careful distance of at least 20 feet between them. The journey was slow, a silent, surreal procession across the sun-scorched plains. Eleanor led the way, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. What had she done? Taking in a Chiricahua child, a child of the very people who had killed her husband, was not just foolish, it was suicidal. The army station not 30 miles away operated on a simple, brutal calculus when it came to the Chiricahua. They were a threat to be neutralized, their children included. If they found him here, they would likely kill him without a second thought, and her for harboring him. And his own people? If they found him here, what would they think? That she had stolen him? Would they come for him with rifles and war cries, the same way they had come for George's patrol? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. But then she would glance back at the small, limping figure trailing behind her, his face a stoic mask of pain, and the fear would recede, replaced by a stubborn resolve. She had made a choice, and she would see it through. Back inside the cool, dim interior of the cabin, the boy stood frozen by the door, his eyes wide as he took in the strange, alien world of a white woman's home. The sturdy wooden table and chairs, the iron bedstead with its patchwork quilt, the cast-iron stove, the shelves lined with tins and jars. It was a world away from the wickiups and the open sky of his people. Eleanor ignored his awe and his fear, moving with a practiced efficiency. She stoked the fire in the hearth to heat a kettle of water, her movements calm and deliberate. She tore a clean strip from an old linen sheet and retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf. It contained her meager medical supplies, a jar of foul-smelling herbal salve Jedediah had given her, a needle and thread, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. "Come here," she said gently, patting the seat of a wooden chair. "Let me see that leg." The boy remained rooted to the spot, his eyes darting from her to the Remington leaning against the wall, then to the door as if plotting an escape. Eleanor sighed. "I'm not going to hurt you," she repeated, her voice laced with a weariness that went beyond the day's events. "That bite needs cleaning, or the fever will set in. You understand fever?" She mimed shivering and wiped a hand across her brow. Whether he understood her words or her pantomime, she couldn't be sure, but the mention of fever seemed to register. He had likely seen its effects before, the way it could turn a strong warrior into a delirious, dying man. Slowly, hesitantly, he limped toward the chair, and after a moment's pause, sat on the very edge of it, his body tensed, as if ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Up close, she could see him more clearly. He was thin but not starved, his small frame wiry and strong. His skin was the color of rich, polished copper, and his hair was a sheet of glossy black silk. But it was his eyes that held her. They were ancient eyes in a child's face, dark and deep, and filled with a sorrow that seemed too vast for his small years. He had seen things, she realized, things no child should ever have to see. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly as she knelt before him, dipping the linen strip into the warm water. "Eleanor Vance." He said nothing, his jaw set in a stubborn line. His silence was not just the result of fear, she began to suspect. It was a conscious act of defiance, a shield against her and her world. "I don't know your name," she continued, her voice a low murmur as she began to gently clean the wound on his leg. "So I'll have to call you something. I'll call you Noden." In the language of a tribe from a land she'd long since left, it meant wind. It seemed to fit the wild, untamable spirit she sensed in him. He flinched when the warm cloth touched his skin, but he did not pull away. He watched her, his dark eyes unblinking, as she carefully cleaned the jagged tears in his flesh. The bite was deep, the flesh torn in 2 places. It would need stitches. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, holding up the needle. She took a swig of the whiskey and then poured a little onto the wound. The boy let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of breath, his hands gripping the edge of the chair until his knuckles were white. But he did not cry out. Eleanor's respect for him grew. He had more courage than many of the grown men she had known. She worked quickly, her stitches small and neat, a skill learned from mending clothes and horse blankets, now applied to human flesh. The boy sat unnaturally still, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. He seemed to have retreated into himself, to a place where her clumsy attempts at medicine could not touch him. When she was finished, she coated the wound in the thick, pungent salve and wrapped it tightly with the remaining linen. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "That should hold." She rose and moved to the stove, her own body aching with a weariness that was both physical and emotional. She ladled a measure of rabbit stew from the pot simmering on the stove into a bowl. She had eaten little that day, but her own hunger was a distant concern. She placed the bowl on the table in front of the boy, along with a wooden spoon. He stared at the stew, then at her, his expression unreadable. He made no move to eat. "You need to eat," Eleanor urged, "to get your strength back." Still he refused. He had not uttered a single sound since she had brought him to the cabin, his silence an impenetrable fortress. Eleanor felt a pang of frustration. She had saved his life, tended his wound, offered him food and shelter. What more did he want from her? Exhausted, she gave up trying. She took a bowl of stew for herself and sat at the other end of the table, eating in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of her spoon against the bowl and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The boy, Nodin, as she had named him, sat as still as a stone, his small hands resting in his lap. As darkness fell, casting long dancing shadows across the cabin, a new tension began to creep into the room. Eleanor was acutely aware of the boy's presence, of the cultural chasm that separated them, a chasm that felt as wide and as deep as the Grand Canyon. She had a Chiricahua child in her home, a child of the people who had killed her husband. The reality of her situation settled upon her with a crushing weight. She prepared her own bed, a simple cot in the corner of the room, her movements slow and deliberate. She then laid a spare blanket on the floor near the hearth, a safe distance from her own bed, but close enough to the warmth of the fire. "You can sleep here," she said, pointing to the blanket. The boy watched her, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. He gave no indication that he had heard or understood. Eleanor sighed and retreated to her cot, too tired to argue or coax. She lay down, her clothes still on, the Remington propped against the wall within arm's reach. She did not expect to sleep. She expected to lie awake all night, listening to the boy's breathing, waiting for the sound of Chiricahua war cries or the thunder of army hooves. But exhaustion was a potent drug. Her eyelids grew heavy, and the sounds of the night, the cry of a screech owl, the distant howl of a lone coyote, the whisper of the wind, began to lull her into a state of semi-consciousness. She drifted in a shallow, restless sleep, her dreams a tangled mess of wolf fangs and her husband's smiling face. She was awoken some time later by a sound. It was not the wind nor an animal. It was a soft, whimpering cry, the sound of a child in the grip of a nightmare. Eleanor sat up, her heart pounding. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was bathed in a soft orange light. The boy was thrashing on the blanket, his small body contorted. He cried out again, a single guttural word in a language she did not understand. He was dreaming, his face slick with sweat, his hands clenched into fists. Forgetting her fear, forgetting that he was the son of her enemy, Eleanor swung her legs off the cot and crossed the room. She knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his shoulder, uncertain. What comfort could she, a white woman, offer to a child of the Chiricahua? "It's all right," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "You're safe. It was just a dream." She laid a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. His skin was hot, too hot. The fever she had feared was setting in. He continued to murmur in his sleep, his words frantic and disjointed. She could only make out one word, repeated over and over, a name perhaps, Taza. She did what she would have done for her own child. She fetched a cloth and dipped it in the cool water from the basin. She sat beside him, gently wiping his brow, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing. She murmured soft, soothing words, not in any language, just sounds of comfort, the universal language of a mother. Slowly, under her gentle ministrations, the boy's thrashing subsided. His breathing deepened, and he slipped from the grip of the nightmare into a true deep sleep. Eleanor sat with him for a long time, the cool cloth in her hand, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. The silence of the cabin returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer the empty, lonely silence of her grief. It was a shared silence, a silence filled with the presence of another human being, a small, fragile life that had, for now, been entrusted to her care. As the first faint hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Eleanor looked at the sleeping boy, his face now peaceful, and felt a profound and unsettling shift within her. The hatred she had nurtured for 3 years, the bitter resentment against the people who had taken her husband, had begun to erode. It was being replaced by something else, something she couldn't yet name. All she knew was that this child, this silent Chiricahua boy she had pulled from the jaws of wolves, had also pulled her from the jaws of her own solitary grief, and she was terrified of what would happen next. The next 2 days passed in a haze of fever and watchful silence. The boy, Noden, drifted in and out of consciousness, his small body racked with shivers despite the oppressive heat of the day. Eleanor was a constant, tireless presence at his side. She bathed his face and neck with cool water, forced sips of willow bark tea, an old remedy for fever Jedediah had taught her, between his cracked lips, and changed the dressing on his leg, which was red and angry-looking. He fought her at times, his delirium making him see her as a threat, but she was persistent, her gentle strength a surprising match for his fever-fueled struggles. During his lucid moments, he would simply watch her, his dark eyes filled with a weary confusion. He still refused to speak, his silence a stubborn, unbroken vow. Eleanor found herself talking to him constantly, filling the quiet cabin with the sound of her voice. She told him about her life before the territory, about the green hills of her childhood home in Ohio, about her father, who was a doctor, and her mother, who grew the most beautiful roses. She spoke of George, not of his death, but of his life, his booming laugh, the way he would hum off-key while he repaired a fence. She talked about her stillborn daughter, a confession whispered into the still, hot air of the cabin, a secret she had never spoken aloud to another living soul. She didn't know if he understood her words, but he seemed to listen, his gaze fixed on her face. It was as if he was absorbing her stories, her sorrows, her very essence. And in the telling, Eleanor felt a lightening in her own soul, a release of pressure she hadn't even been aware of. The ghosts of her past were still there, but now they had a witness. On the third day, the fever broke. Eleanor awoke to find Noden sitting up on his blanket, his eyes clear and focused. He was still weak, but the delirium was gone. He was watching her with an intensity that was unnerving. When their eyes met, he looked away, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Later that morning, he accepted a bowl of thin broth from her, his first real food in days. He ate slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving her face. The silence between them was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a wall of fear and defiance. It was something more complex, a space of cautious observation, of mutual assessment. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps now he would speak. Perhaps he would tell her his name, his story, where he came from. But the day wore on and he remained silent, a small, enigmatic presence in her cabin. The quiet truce was shattered in the late afternoon by the sound of approaching horses. It wasn't the sound of a lone rider like Jedediah. It was the rhythmic beat of multiple hooves, steady and purposeful, the sound of cavalry. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. 4 riders were approaching, their blue uniforms a stark, unwelcome sight against the brown and green of the plains. They were from the fort, and they were heading directly for her cabin. "Get down!" she hissed at the boy, her voice sharp with urgency. "And don't make a sound." Noden, seeing the raw fear in her face, scrambled from his blanket and crawled under the low bedstead, pulling the patchwork quilt down to conceal himself. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic pounding of her heart. She smoothed her hair, straightened her apron, and schooled her features into a mask of placid neutrality. She opened the door just as the riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. The man in the lead was Sergeant Miles Corrigan, a thick-set man with a florid face and small, suspicious eyes. He was a man who enjoyed the small measure of authority his uniform gave him, and he had made his unwelcome advances on Eleanor more than once in the past after George's death. She despised him. "Afternoon, Mrs. Vance," Corrigan said, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in her slightly disheveled appearance. "A little far out for a social call, I know. Just on patrol." "Sergeant," Eleanor acknowledged, her voice cool and even. "What can I do for you?" "We're looking for a stray," Corrigan said, dismounting. The other 3 men remained on their horses, their rifles held loosely in their laps, their eyes scanning the horizon. And Chiricahua Whelp wandered off from the Mesa Verde reservation a few days back. "Boy about 6 years old. You ain't seen anything unusual, have you?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. It had to be Noden. "The only thing I ever see out here is dust and rabbits, Sergeant," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within her. "You know that." Corrigan's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "Funny thing is," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "we tracked him to this area. Tracks disappeared about a quarter-mile from here, near the rocky outcrop." He gestured with his head to the place where she had found Noden, almost as if someone picked him up. Eleanor held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the boy's presence under the bed, a silent, terrified weight. "If a child was out here alone, Sergeant, I imagine the wolves would have found him long before I did." "Maybe," Corrigan said, not convinced. His gaze drifted past her into the dim interior of the cabin. "You're all alone out here, Eleanor. It ain't safe. A woman on her own." He used her first name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "I could be persuaded to check the interior, make sure everything's secure." The threat was unmistakable. He was using his authority to try and intimidate her, to force his way into her home, into her life. The old Eleanor might have been cowed, might have backed down, but the woman who had faced down a wolf pack was not so easily intimidated. "I am perfectly capable of securing my own home, Sergeant," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "My husband taught me how to use a rifle, and I'm a very good shot. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have chores to do." She made to close the door, but Corrigan put a hand out to stop it. His face was flushed with anger at her rejection. "You'd be wise to remember who your friends are, Eleanor," he snarled. "There's a bounty on that Chiricahua boy. $50. A lot of money for a lonely widow." The words hung in the air between them, a vile insinuation. He thought she was hiding the boy for money. The idea was so grotesque, so far from the truth, that a raw, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. "Get off my land, Sergeant," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Corrigan stared at her for a long moment, his little eyes filled with malice. He was not used to being defied, especially not by a woman. But there was something in her eyes, a glint of hard, unyielding steel, that made him hesitate. He was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward at heart. With a final, contemptuous sneer, he turned and swung himself back onto his horse. "Have it your way, widow," he spat. "But when the Chiricahua come knocking, don't come crying to the U.S. Cavalry." He spurred his horse and galloped away, his men following close behind, leaving Eleanor standing in a cloud of dust and impotent rage. She slammed the door shut, the sound echoing the violent turmoil in her chest. She leaned against it, her body trembling, her knuckles white. After a long moment, she heard a soft rustling sound. Noden crawled out from under the bed, his eyes wide with a fear that was now mingled with something else, a dawning comprehension. He may not have understood all the words, but he had understood the tone, the threat, the danger. He had understood that she had protected him. He stood before her, a small, silent figure, in the center of the room. He looked at her, at the door, and then back at her, and then, for the first time since she had found him, he spoke. His voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it filled the silence of the cabin like a thunderclap. "Taza," he said, and pointed to himself. Eleanor stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. It was the name he had cried out in his fevered dreams. His name. He then took a hesitant step toward her. He reached out a small tentative hand and touched her arm. It was a gesture of profound, heartbreaking trust, a bridge across the chasm of fear and hatred that had separated their two peoples for generations. In that single simple touch, everything changed. He was no longer just a Chiricahua boy she had rescued. He was Taza, and she was no longer just a lonely widow hiding from the world. She was his protector. And she would protect him from the likes of Sergeant Corrigan, from the bounty hunters, from the entire world if she had to, whatever the cost. The boy's name was Taza. The revelation of it, a single whispered word, had shattered the silence that had defined their strange, fragile coexistence. It was a beginning, a seed of trust planted in the barren soil of their shared isolation. In the days that followed, Taza remained a child of few words, but the oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a tentative, emerging connection. He began to follow her as she did her chores, a small, silent shadow, his dark eyes observing her every move with an unnerving intelligence. He watched her knead bread, mend a fence post, clean her rifle. He learned her rhythms, the quiet cadence of her solitary life. One afternoon, he pointed to the Remington leaning against the wall. "Rifle," he said, his voice soft. Eleanor, startled, realized it was the Chiricahua word for the rifle. He then pointed to the skillet on the stove. "Plate, a plate." He was teaching her, bridging the gap between their worlds, one word at a time. Eleanor, in turn, pointed to the object and repeated the English word, rifle, plate. It became a game between them, a quiet exchange of language and knowledge that filled the long, hot afternoons. She learned that Taza was a keen observer of the natural world. He showed her which roots were edible, which berries were sweet, and which were poisonous. He could read the tracks of animals in the dust, telling her not just the creature that had passed, but how long ago and whether it was in a hurry. He was a child of the wilderness, and his knowledge was a currency far more valuable than the $50 bounty on his head. Her fear for him was a constant, gnawing presence. She scanned the horizon a dozen times a day, her heart lurching at the sight of a dust cloud or a distant rider. She knew Corrigan would not forget her defiance. He was a man who nursed a grudge, and the $50 was a powerful incentive for every desperate man in the territory. She took to barring the door at night and keeping the Remington even closer. One evening, about a week after Corrigan's visit, Jedediah Stone arrived. His 2 mules, laden with beaver and fox pelts, looked as weary as the old trapper himself. Jedediah was a man carved from the very rock and wood of the frontier, his face a leathery mask of wrinkles, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of the winter sky. He had been a friend of George's, and his visits were a welcome anchor to a world she had almost forgotten. She saw him coming from a long way off, and her first instinct was to hide Tasse, but she quickly dismissed the thought. Jedediah was not like the others. He had lived among the tribes in his youth, spoke a smattering of several native languages, and held a grudging respect for the Chiricahua that was rare among the white men of the territory. If she couldn't trust Jedediah, she couldn't trust anyone. She met him outside, a mug of coffee already in her hand. "Jedediah," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "You're a sight for sore eyes." "Eleanor," he grunted, swinging his long legs off his horse. He took the mug and drank deeply, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Still making the best coffee in the territory, I see." His gaze drifted to the cabin door, where Taza stood, half hidden, peering out at the strange mountain of a man. Jedediah's eyes, so often filled with a weary amusement, sharpened with a sudden, intense focus. He didn't seem surprised, but a deep, somber gravity settled over his features. "Looks like you got company," he said, his voice low. "His name is Taza," Eleanor said simply. "I found him. The wolves had him cornered." Jedediah nodded slowly, his eyes still on the boy. "Chiricahua," he said. It wasn't a question. He walked slowly towards the cabin, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He stopped a few feet from Taza and knelt down, a difficult, creaking process for his old bones. "Yai," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. It was a Chiricahua greeting. Taza's eyes widened. He stared at the old trapper for a long moment, then gave a hesitant, almost imperceptible nod in return. That evening, as Taza slept on his blanket by the fire, Eleanor told Jedediah everything. The wolves, the fever, Sergeant Corrigan, and his bounty. The fragile, emerging bond with the silent boy. Jedediah listened patiently, his gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When she had finished, he was silent for a long time. "You've stepped in it deep, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice heavy. "Deeper than you know." "What do you mean?" "This boy," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "His name is not just Taza. He is the son of Kochi." Eleanor stared at him, her blood turning to ice. Kochi. The name was a legend in the territory, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and awe. He was the chief of the Chiricahua, a brilliant and ruthless war leader who had waged a bloody, decade-long war against the whites after the treachery of the Mesa Verde affair. He was the man who had led the band that had killed her husband. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The boy sleeping so peacefully by her fire, the child she had come to care for, was the son of the man she held responsible for shattering her life. The irony was a cruel, vicious twist of the knife. "Kochi's son," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "But how?" "Kochi has two sons," Jedediah explained. "The older is Nish, the younger is Taza. I heard whispers at the Mesa Verde agency. Kochi has been trying to make peace. He agreed to move his people to the new reservation, a gesture of goodwill. But a faction of his own people, led by a warrior named Geronimo, they don't trust the White Eyes. They want to keep fighting. There's a rift among the Chiricahua. The boy must have wandered off or gotten separated from his family." "And Corrigan knows who he is?" Eleanor asked, her mind racing. "Maybe not that he's Kochi's son," Jedediah said. "But he knows he's a valuable bargaining chip or an easy $50. Either way, the boy is in terrible danger from the army, from bounty hunters, and even from his own people if Geronimo's faction thinks he can be used as leverage against his father." Eleanor looked at the sleeping boy, at the rise and fall of his small chest, and felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had thought her world was small and simple. Now she found herself at the epicenter of a conflict that could set the entire territory ablaze. "What do I do, Jedediah?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old trapper looked at her, his pale eyes filled with a sad wisdom. "The boy's people will be looking for him," he said. "Kochi will not rest until he finds his son. Your best hope is that they find him before Corrigan does." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "But they will not come in war. Kochi is a man of honor. If they know the boy is safe, they will be grateful." "How can they know he's safe?" Eleanor asked desperately. "They'll see a white woman, and they'll think I've stolen him. They'll kill me." "Maybe," Jedediah admitted. "Or maybe they'll see what I see, a woman who saved a child's life." He stood up, his joints popping. "I've got to be moving on at dawn. But you listen to me, Eleanor. You keep that boy safe, and you watch the horizon, and you pray that it's the Chiricahua who find you first." Jedediah left the next morning, leaving Eleanor with a new, heavier burden of fear and a sliver of desperate hope. The knowledge that Taza was Kochi's son changed everything. He was no longer just a boy. He was a prince, a symbol, the key to war or peace. 2 nights later, the prayer Jedediah had spoken of was answered. Eleanor was woken from a light, restless sleep, not by a sound, but by a change in the atmosphere, a sudden prickling awareness that she was no longer alone. The air in the cabin felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. She reached for the Remington, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Taza was already awake, sitting up on his blanket, his eyes fixed on the door. He was not afraid. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, she could see that his expression was one of solemn, reverent expectation. And then she saw them. Through the small window, she could see figures moving in the darkness, silent, shadowy forms that seemed to rise from the earth itself. They were on foot, their movement fluid and ghostly. They were surrounding her cabin. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. The Chiricahua had come. They had come for the son of their chief. She clutched the Remington, her knuckles white, her mind a chaotic jumble of fear and resignation. She had done her best to protect him, but now it was over. She could not fight an entire war party. She could only pray that they would be merciful. She waited for the war cries, for the splintering of the door, for the hail of arrows and bullets. But there was only silence, a deep, profound silence that was more unnerving than any sound. Taza rose to his feet. He walked to the door, his small form silhouetted against the faint moonlight. He looked back at her, his dark eyes conveying a message she could not decipher. Then he unbarred the door and opened it. Eleanor's heart stopped. On the threshold stood a warrior. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of stern, impassive dignity. He wore a simple breechcloth and moccasins, his chest bare, his long black hair held back by a leather band. In his hand he held not a rifle or a lance, but a single eagle feather. Behind him, in the moonlight, Eleanor could see dozens of other warriors, all standing in a silent semicircle around her cabin. They were not painted for war. Their faces were solemn, their hands empty. Taza stepped forward and spoke a single word. "Abe," he said. "Father." The tall warrior's impassive mask crumbled, his eyes, so like his son's, filled with a profound, overwhelming relief. He knelt and enveloped the boy in his arms, holding him tightly, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion. This was Kochi, the great war chief. The terror of the territory was on his knees at her doorstep, weeping with joy at the return of his son. Eleanor stood frozen, the Remington still clutched in her hands, a silent, stunned witness to the scene. After a long moment, Kochi released his son and rose to his full, imposing height. His eyes, still glistening with unshed tears, found hers. He looked at her, at the rifle in her hands, at the simple, clean cabin behind her. His gaze was searching, intense, as if he was trying to read her very soul. He said something in his own language, his voice a low, powerful rumble. Taza, still standing by his father's side, translated for the first time in a full sentence. "My father asks why you have not claimed the bounty for his son." Eleanor stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. "The bounty?" "The white soldier Corrigan," Taza explained, his small face serious. "He came to my father's camp. He said he knew where I was. He said a white woman had me, and she would give me back for $50. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with a sickening thud. Corrigan hadn't just threatened her. He had gone to the Chiricahua. He had tried to play both sides against each other to profit from the situation, not caring about the bloodshed he might cause. He had told the Chiricahua that she was a bounty hunter, holding the boy for ransom. "That's a lie," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "I never asked for any money. I saved him from the wolves. I was protecting him." Kochi listened to his son's translation, his expression unreadable. He then took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He was so close now that she could see the lines of grief and worry etched around his eyes, the gray streaks in his black hair. He was not the monster of her imagination. He was a man, a father who had feared for the life of his child. He spoke again, his voice softer this time. Taza translated, "My father says he knows this. He says, a man who lies for money has a shifty heart. He says he came not to fight, but to see the woman who would save the son of her enemy. He says he has brought gifts." He gestured to the warriors behind him. They began to move forward one by one, their movements silent and graceful. They came to her doorstep and laid their offerings on the ground. There were beautifully tanned deer hides, so soft they looked like velvet. There were intricately woven baskets filled with dried corn and mesquite beans. There was a magnificent blanket woven with the colors of the sunset. And finally, one warrior laid down a rifle, a brand new Spencer repeating carbine, far superior to her old Remington. Eleanor stared at the pile of gifts, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. This was not the retribution she had feared. This was gratitude. It was an offering of peace, of respect, from the very people she had been taught to hate. Kochi spoke a final time. "My father says you have shown great honor," Taza said, his voice filled with pride. "He says the Chiricahua will not forget. This land you live on, it is your land now. No Chiricahua will ever harm you or your home. You are one of us. You are Shima Yazi." "What does that mean?" Eleanor whispered. Taza smiled, a rare, beautiful sight. "It means Little Mother." As the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the Chiricahua warriors melted back into the wilderness as silently as they had come. Kochi was the last to leave. He stood for a moment, his hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze meeting Eleanor's over the pile of gifts. He gave a single solemn nod, a gesture of profound, unspoken understanding, and then he was gone. Eleanor was left alone in the quiet of the morning, the pile of gifts at her feet, a testament to the incredible events of the night. She looked at her small, humble cabin, at the vast, empty plains that stretched out before her. It was the same land, the same sky, the same silence. But everything had changed. The ghosts of her past had not vanished, but they no longer held the same power over her. The hatred that had been her constant companion for 3 long years had been washed away, replaced by something new, something fragile, something that felt a little like hope. She had pulled a crying Chiricahua boy from a wolf pack, and in return his tribe had pulled her from the wilderness of her own grief and given her a new name, a new identity, a new place in the world. She was no longer just a widow. She was Shima Yazi. And for the first time in a long time, she was not alone. In the heart of a land defined by violence and mistrust, a single act of compassion rewrote the rules of survival. Eleanor Vance, a woman entombed by her own sorrow, chose not to see an enemy but a child in peril. In saving Taza, she not only rescued a boy but also found her own salvation, bridging a chasm of hatred with a bridge of shared humanity.